In the beautiful city of Eden, there lived a young man named Chris. Chris had a very strong desire for sex. Every night he felt the urge to find a girl on the streets and take her home with him. He couldn't seem to resist this temptation, and it became a regular part of his routine. He never liked spending a night alone, so he found companionship in this way, despite being 32 years old and successful in his career. Solomon struggled with a very strong desire for sex. He took his work very seriously and had achieved financial stability. But this aspect of his personal life really troubled him. Although his friends suggested that he settles down and starts a family, Chris had reservations. He dreamed of marrying a virgin, but he believed it was nearly impossible to find one in the city where he lived. He noticed that many people around were involved in activities like prostitution and casual hookups on the other side of the city. In a small village called Loam, there lived two poor orphan sisters named Mary and Jane. They struggled to navigate through life, and life was so hard for them. Mary and Jane were two striking, the similar sisters who had been offered and relied on each other for support. While they shared a close resemblance, Mary was 26 years old and Jane was just 24 years old. Despite their bond, their path in life was very different. Mary engaged in prostitution to make ends meet for herself and her sister, while Jane was always home trying to look for the best possible way to help out at home because she didn't want to seek that kind of lifestyle. Mary got really sick one day with malaria and she couldn't do her job anymore. She asked Jane to do it instead, but Jane said no because she didn't want to have sex with strangers. This made Mary really mad because she needed the money. She felt like her sister was letting her down. This made Mary really mad because she felt like Jane was not helping them survive like they had planned. Mary got even more upset and told Jane she had to go out to work or move out of the town village home they used to stay in. Jane didn't want to leave, but she stayed firm and said she wouldn't change her mind because she wanted to keep her virginity and stick to her beliefs and morals reluctantly. Jane gave to Mary's demands as she got ready to leave. Mary dressed her in her own clothes, necklaces, bracelets, and earrings. Before she left, Jane dressed in very revealing clothes. She stood by the roadside. While she stood on the roadside, an expensive car put up in front of her, and it was Chris. He asked her how much for a night, and Jane, still feeling bitter, reluctantly named the price. Then he invited her to get into the car. Inside the car, Chris began to touch Jane's legs, complimenting her beauty. Despite her irritation, she tried to smile, though her true feelings were evident in her expression. When they arrived at the hotel, Jane felt very nervous. Chris suggested they go to a club to have fun before heading to the room. But Jane didn't agree. However, Chris promised to pay her more money, so she reluctantly accepted in the club. Chris offered Jane a drink, but she refused because she doesn't drink. And she doesn't know much about these kinds of places, Chris insisted, and eventually Jane felt pressured to drink. Jane's main reason for being there in the first place was to avoid being kicked out of the house by her sister. Chris noticed Jane's hesitant and timid behavior, and he assumed she was new to this kind of work. Jane became very drunk that night, and she couldn't function properly seeing this. Chris decided to take her to the room he had arranged for himself and her. He gently placed her on the bed and then left to freshen up himself. Chris entered the room and tried to wake Jane up, but she wasn't responding well due to being heavily intoxicated. He then proceeded to undress both himself and her. Jane, in her intoxicated state, managed to protest against Chris's advances, telling him she was a virgin. However, Chris dismissed her words, thinking she was just talking because she was drunk. He continued trying to be intimate with her, but Jane kept repeating that she was a virgin. Jane cried out, "I'm not a prostitute. I just needed this money, so my sister won't send me away from her house frustrated." Chris insisted she stops talking and eventually raised his voice, telling her that her payment is on the table, and to be quiet. Jane finally complied, and Chris proceeded with his actions despite her continued objections. Chris had never kissed the street girls before. He just went directly inside them without any type of romance. But this time, he felt like kissing Jane. He felt she was special and admired her beautiful face. He kissed and romanced Jane. Then he went inside her, though. While wearing protection, It was his first time enjoying sex. Her body was tight, not loose like other girls he had been with before he enjoyed himself, before they both slept off. Chris woke up in the morning, expecting to see Jane beside him, but she wasn't there. Confused, he looked around the room, but Jane was nowhere to be found. As Chris got out of bed, he noticed blood everywhere, in the sheets on his body, and around the room, shocked and alarmed. He realized the significance of the stains and what had likely occurred during the night. Despite his initial admiration for Jane, Chris felt girl he met on the streets. He knew his friends would tease him about it. One of his friends, Luca, noticed Chris's mood and tried to cheer him up when Luke showed him a photo of a beautiful girl on Facebook. Chris wasn't interested at first, but Luke insisted. When Chris looked at the photo, he saw Mary wearing the same necklace that Jane had left behind. He asked Luke to send him the screenshot of Mary's profile later. When Chris was home, he checked Mary's profile and saw a picture of her that looked a lot like Jane wearing the same necklace. He felt like he had finally found the person he had been looking for more than 2 weeks since Mary's phone number was on her profile. Chris decided to take note of it. He tried calling Mary, but she couldn't answer the call. Chris decided he would try calling her again the next day. When he weren't to work the next day at work, Chris called Mary again, and she finally picked up. "Hello," Mary answered. "Hi." "It's Chris," he said. "I'm really sorry about what happened the other night. I took your virginity just for money, and I feel very terrible about it. I want to see you again and give you back the necklace you left behind." Mary, cleverly realizing Chris was referring to her sister Jane, she played along. She asked Chris how he got her number, and he explained he found it on Facebook. They agreed to meet at the mall to exchange the necklace at the moral Chris and Mary made up, although he noticed some differences with Mary compared to Jane. Her face was the same. He apologized again and charged her not to go back to the streets. Mary explained that she had to due to her aunt's demands. "My aunt will send me out of the house if I don't go to the streets." Mary replied, "I have nowhere else to go or stay." In response, Chris offered her enough money to find accommodation and start a business so she wouldn't have to return to the streets. Grateful, Mary accepted, and Chris gave her a check for a large amount of money. Before they say their goodbyes, when Chris got home, he felt a difference in his connection with Mary compared to Jane. He couldn't shake the feeling that Mary seemed more exposed after thinking it over. He assumed it was because they hadn't seen each other over a long time. Mary went home feeling incredibly excited. "I've hit the jackpot," she said to herself. "Not only will I not have to leave here, but I'll also be able to get a shop and have a handsome and wealthy guy like Chris." Mary was on top of the world. A few days later, she started packing her things in the house when Jane asked where she was going. Mary replied aggressively, "I'm finding my own way. I can't keep staying in this dirty place." Jane pleaded with her to at least tell her where she was going, but she refused to share any details. Mary moved to a new house out of the village, and Jane was left there all alone. Suffering Mary started a big clothing and jewelry business. Chris continues to communicate with Mary over the phone, and he was happy to hear that she was doing well. However, he still felt like something was missing. Chris decided to take Mary to his house and showed her where he lived, and to her surprise, he lived alone. Mary's eyes widened, and she smiled to herself, realizing that her life had changed for the better. Chris continues to support Mary financially so that she wouldn't like anything at all one day. Chris arrived at work to find his office in a mess. He called his secretary to inquire why the cleaner hadn't shown up, only to learn that the cleaner had stopped coming. The secretary had quickly tied up the office herself. Chris instructed her to put up a notice outside the office for the position of a cleaner. Meanwhile, Jane had been searching for a job outside of her village near the city because it was difficult for her to make ends meet. Since Mary had left her when she saw the signboard advertising the cleaner position at Chris's office, she wasted no time and applied for the job the secretary asked her to start work the next day. Jane resumed work late the next day and quickly began sweeping the office when Chris entered and saw his dusty table. He instructed his secretary to call the new cleaner to clean his table. and mopped the floor, which he did. As Chris turned to make a phone call, Jane entered the office to clean the table and chairs. In the process, she accidentally knocked over a foe, causing both her and to bend down to pick it up. Their heads collided, and when they looked at each other, they recognized each other's faces, shocked to see Chris. Jane tried to run from the office, but Solomon stopped her by holding her waist from behind. Jane apologized, saying she was sorry for being rude. Chris saw the innocence on her face, the same innocence he had seen the night they had met, feeling a deep connection as he touched her. Chris realized there was something special about Jane. He asked her why she was there after he had opened a big shop for her. Jane simply replied, "I'm sorry, sir. Please let me go." While Chris demanded answers from Jane, Mary called him. They talked while Jane was in front of him. After the call, Chris seemed shocked and asked Jane who she was. Jane, shivering with fear, pleaded with him to let her go. Chris assured her that he wouldn't hurt her and persuaded her to sit down. He then asked her if she had a twin, but Jane replied that she only had an elder sister who looked exactly like her, and people often mistook them for twins. Still surprised, Chris asked for her name, and she replied, "Jane." Chris then showed her the photo Luke had sent him earlier, this necklace. "You forgot it in the hotel room. Is this not you wearing the necklace in this photo?" Chris asked. Jane replied, "That's my elder sister. How did you get her photo on your phone?" Chris replied, "Never mind," and shifted closer to the chair where Jane was sitting. He apologized sincerely for hurting her that night, and explained that he had been searching for her ever since he acknowledged that he had made a mistake by taking her virginity in such a way. And he asked Jane to give him a chance to make things right. Jane insisted that he hadn't done anything wrong because he had paid for the services, but Chris continued to plead for her forgiveness. He then asked for her phone number, but Jane didn't have a phone. When he requested her address, she explained that the place didn't have an address. Despite their conversation, Jane expressed her desire to continue her work because she had other offices to clean. Chris picked up the rug and threw it away, telling Moza that she wouldn't work as a cleaner anymore. He then took her out to buy a phone and accompanied her back home. When they arrived, Chris noticed photos of Jane and Mary on the wall and the poor condition of the room. As he was going through the photos, the landlord arrived to throw Jane's belongings out of the house because she had owned rent for almost 5 months. Despite Chris's attempt to reason with the landlord, he refused to listen in response. Chris gathered Jane's belongings and took her to his own home. Jane had many emotions when she moved in with Chris. She was grateful for his help, but she also felt a little too much to handle. Chris really wanted to assist Jane. However, how could he notice that Jane seemed uncomfortable staying there for even just a day? So he decided to find her a better place to stay. He called his lawyer to help arrange for the house. While Chris was talking to his lawyer, Jane walked in unexpectedly. Chris quickly ended the call and told the lawyer he would call back. Curious, Jane asked why Chris was doing so much for her when she had nothing to offer in return. Chris reassured her that he didn't expect anything in return and just wanted her to relax. But Jane, feeling uncertain, suggested that if Chris brought her here just to be into with her, then she couldn't stay. Chris responded firmly, saying he called his lawyer to find her a better place for accommodation. He confessed his feelings for Jane, saying that he liked her a lot and he was even in love with her. However, he emphasized that he wouldn't force her to accept his feelings. Instead, he promised to assist her, regardless of their relationship status. The next day, Chris and Jane went to see different apartments. Chris said he would pay for whichever one Jane liked best. They visited a few places, but Jane didn't like any of them, even though the apartments they saw were all nice and costly. Jane felt like she could trust Chris. She felt safe around him and started thinking about staying with him in his house. Chris and Jane went back to his house. He promised that he would go apartment hunting again the next day, so she could choose one she liked. But Jane surprised him by saying she wanted to stay in the house. She asked him to promise not to be physical with her. Chris smiled with excitement and said, "I'm grateful you trust me. I won't come close except you want me to." Jane smiled and replied, "So you still want to get close with my consent?" Chris responded sarcastically, saying yes, because I love you so much. You changed me since that day we met in the hotel. I stopped womanizing. I couldn't go a day without touching a woman. But she indirectly and directly turned me away from all women. Solomon was curious about Jane's background, so he asked her to share more about herself. He wanted to know where she grew up, about her family, and what happened that made her end up on the streets that day. Jane shared with Chris that both her parents had passed away a while back, leaving her with just her elder sister. Life in their village was tough, so they decided to move to the city to try to make a living. They had a plan to work hard, but unfortunately her sister ended up on the streets. Despite this, her sister always took care of the bills. However, on the day Jane ended up on the streets, her sister was sick and unable to work. She felt pressured to go out and hustle to make ends meet. Her sister even threatened to kick her out if she couldn't go with nowhere else to tell. Jane had no choice but to join her sister on the street. As Jane recounted her story, tears run up in her eyes. Chris felt a wave of empathy for her and put her into a comforting embrace as he cried. While sharing her difficult experience, Jane also asked Chris why he was womanizing. He explained that many women were interested in him because of his money, and some even deceived him. Since then, he felt that instead of being with women who are only interested in his wealth, it would be better to pick girls from the streets. He believed that they might be more genuine and not after his money. Jane comforted Chris, and they shared a comforting hug. Meanwhile, it had been a week since Mary had been trying to reach Chris, but he refused to answer her calls because he knew she was an imposter. Despite his avoidance, Mary decided to pay him a visit at his house. Jane and Chris had become good friends after their heart. Jane felt safer with him, and he appreciated her trust one day. While they were relaxing at Chris's house, there was a knock on the door. Chris went to answer it, and to Jane's surprise, it was Mary. Mary looked shocked to see Jane in Chris's house. She looked at Jane suspiciously. "Why are you here?" she asked. Jane felt scared. "I am staying with Chris," she said quietly. Mary softened a little, but still seemed angry why she asked. Jane glanced at Chris for help. "Chris is helping me find a place to stay." She explained I didn't have anywhere else to go. Mary seemed a bit calmer. Then she turned to Chris, looking angry again. "Why did you bring her here?" she demanded. Chris, with a serious look. "Since you left her and you are pretending to be her," he said. Jane feared her brows in confusion. "Pretending to be her?" she asked. Puzzled, Chris explained how Mary had pretended to be Jane, but he was relieved that he finally found the real Jane. Before Jane could fully understand, Mary tried to push her away, insisting they go to her house. But Jane refused, and Chris stepped in to protect her. "Leave her alone." "Mary," Chris said firmly. Mary glared at Jane, threatening to deal with her later, before storming out of the house, feeling furious that Jane might take Chris away from her when Mary got home. She decided to visit her uncles and aunts in the village to seek their help in evicting Jane from Chris' house. So she journeyed to the village and lied to her relatives, who had never helped her before, to come and take Jane away from Chris. They all agreed and arrived in the city, and Mary took them to Chris's house. But unfortunately, he wasn't there. Jane opened the door and welcomed them in. The aunts and uncles entered the house knowing Chris would be a very rich man, so they wanted to strike a deal that would benefit them. Not Mary, the aunts and uncles spoke amongst themselves and agreed to wait for Chris to return. However, Mary was impatient and wanted them to forcefully remove Jane from the house. But because of their own selfish interest, they realized that if they took Jane out and Chris returned without seeing her, he might call a police report against them. Jane decided to call Chris to come home due to an emergency, and he rushed home only to find a lot of strangers in his house. He greeted them and they introduced themselves. As Jane's paternal relatives, they told Chris they came to take Jane away because it was against their tradition for a girl to stay in the same house with a man who wasn't her husband. Chris replied, I'm sorry about breaking your tradition, but I would really love to marry Jane. When Mary heard this, she got very angry. The uncles and aunts replied to Chris, now you are talking. They invited Chris to their village to take the list for marriage arrangements. Mary told her uncles and auntie that this wasn't the reason she invited them. She invited them to evict Jane from the house, but now they were arranging a marriage. Chris promised Jane's family that he would come to their village in 3 days' time to take the least and make necessary arrangements. Jane's paternal family were happy, and he gave them a large sum of money to cover their transportation expenses home. This made Mary very angry and furious because her plans had backfired on her after Mary and her relations left Chris's house. Jane confronted him about why he had promised to go to a village and take the marriage list without asking for her consent. First, Chris replied, "That's the best thing I could think of." Jane became angry and stormed out of the sitting room after a heated argument with Chris. Chris went to her room to talk to her, expressing his deep feelings and desire to be her husband. He pleaded with her, telling her that he loved her and promised never to hurt her again. But Jane refused, and Chris, feeling defeated, thought that he would return to his old ways. He left her room. But Jane ran after him and held him from behind, telling him not to go. She refused that she really liked him too, and had grown to love him. Finally, she agreed to marry him, hearing Jane. His words made Chris incredibly happy. He hugged her tightly and kissed her forehead. Meanwhile, Mary was at home, worrying about what to do next since her plan had failed. She couldn't let Jane have such a rich man to herself, so she began plotting her next move. Mary decided to call Jane on the phone to let her know how Chris was hiding a very big secret from her. Jane demanded to know, but Mary said she'll give her the whole details later. But this information really got Jane worried. Jane and Chris planned to visit her hometown to get the marriage list. Even though Jane was worried, Chris took her to meet his uncle first, and other family members. Jane liked spending time with Chris's family. They also welcomed her as well. When they started their journey to Jane's hometown, she couldn't stop worrying. She tried to be happy, but the fear stayed with her. Chris tried to cheer her up, but she felt scared one day. While Jane was out, Mary called again. Her voice this time was very serious, and Jane knew something was wrong. Mary told her that Chris was hiding something big from her. He had HIV. Jane felt shocked and sad hearing this information, not knowing Chris had kept this from her. She knew she had to talk to him and find out the truth she couldn't believe without hearing Chris's side of the story. Once she got home, she hurried to Chris's room to talk to him, but as she approached, she overheard him talking on the phone. He sounded very urgent, saying he needed medicine because he was very sick. Jane's heart sank as she listened in shock. She felt like Mary's words had been confirmed, and she believed Chris did really have HIV. Just like Mary said, feeling betrayed and hurt, she quietly retreated to her room, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe that Chris had kept such a big secret from her, especially after knowing he was sick. She felt like she had been kept in the dark, and the realization left her feeling broken and alone. Meanwhile, the medicine Chris urgently needed was actually for his uncle, who was too unwell to accompany them for the marriage arrangements. Chris worried about his uncle's health, explaining that the urgency to the pharmacist, asking for the medicine as quickly as possible. However, Jane overheard only part of the conversation, and she misunderstood everything. She assumed Chris was referring to himself as being sick and urgently needing medicine. This misunderstanding deepened her belief that Chris had been hiding his HIV status from her. Feeling hurt and betrayed, she couldn't bring herself to confront him about what she heard. She struggled with the weight of emotions between her love for him and the fear of what his secret might mean for their future together. Jane called Mary and told her that Chris was really having the virus. Even though Mary knew it wasn't true, she acted like she believed Jane. Mary told her to leave the house right away because she was worried Chris might give her the virus. Feeling scared and confused, Jane agreed to leave that night. She promised to meet Mary outside, and they would run away together. Jane felt torn between her love for Chris and her fear for her own safety. She knew living Chris would be hard, but she was also afraid of what might happen if they stayed throughout the day. Jane acted distant and uneasy around Chris. He noticed her strange behavior and asked her what was wrong. But Jane brushed it off and didn't say anything. As night fell, Jane quietly packed some of her belongings and headed toward the door, intending to leave without Chris' notice. However, unknown to her, Solomon was outside making phone calls. Just as Jane reached the door, Chris called out her name. Startling her, he asked her where she was going with her bags. At this late hour, Jane felt shocked and caught off guard, but she knew she couldn't hide the truth from Chris any longer. With a heavy heart, Jane decided to confront him. She told him that she shouldn't marry him because he had lied to her and kept something very important. She accused him of having HIV and not telling her about it. Despite their plans for marriage, Jane. Where did you hear that from? Said Chris. Why didn't you just ask me instead of living like this? Jane replied. Mary told me when I came to your room to ask you. I overheard you urgently asking for medicine on the phone, saying you are very sick. Chris laughed. That medicine was for my uncle. I only told the pharmacy so they could bring it quickly, so that my uncle could go well and join us for the wedding. You trust Mary. More than me. It's fine. You can go. If you believe I've been keeping things from you, just leave. I don't want to be with someone who doesn't trust me. I've shown you how much I care and love you, but you've taken me for granted. Jane felt the sincerity standard in Chris's voice. Realizing she needed to apologize, she tried to enter Chris's room, but then Mary was calling Jane, and Jane ignored the call and tried to turn off her phone. She went to Chris's room to ask for forgiveness, but he told her to leave or he will leave instead. Jane approached him and holds him from behind romantically, but Chris remained upset. Jane turned Chris around and hugged him, apologizing and promising that the incident won't happen again. She kissed his forehead and reassured him. Chris responded, saying a May kiss on the forehead once he needed more to forgive her. Jane, feeling shy, asked, "What more do you want?" Chris held her cheeks and said, "I just want you to love me and trust me." Jane thought Chris was going to talk about intimacy, but he actually said the opposite. Chris assured her, "I won't force you. If you want us to be intimate, it will be with your consent." Jane grinned mischievously and said, "I give my consent, but you have to catch me first with that." She dashed out of the room, and Chris ran after her. They played a game of hide and seek, and laughter was filling the air as they chased each other around the house. After a while, they both grew tired from the playful pursuit, and Chris held her down on the couch in the sitting room. Chris and Jane sat close together on the couch, holding hands. Feeling a rush of affection, Jane leaned in and kissed Chris softly. He responded, bonded with warmth, their lips meeting in a gentle embrace, encouraged by her boldness. Jane guided Chris's hand to her cheek, relishing the touch Chris, drawn to her longing gaze, drew near his kisses, becoming more intense. Each kiss deepened their connection. Jane's heart raised as Chris's hand exported her body, tenderly sending shivers down her spine with whispered words of love. Jane led Chris to the bedroom, their movements filled with passion and closeness. As they gave in to their desires, their love-making became a beautiful expression of their love and affection. Each moment affirming their bond. Meanwhile, Mary grew tired of waiting for Jane outside Chris's compound. Feeling frustrated and impatient, she decided to leave. Chris woke up very early that day, and he made something special for Jane. He decided to make breakfast for her. He went to the kitchen and found some eggs, breads, and fruits. He made scrambled eggs and toast. He also cut some fruits to put on the side. After preparing the breakfast, he carried it carefully to his room. He wanted to surprise her with breakfast in bed. Jane was still asleep when he entered the room. Chris gently woke her up and presented the breakfast to her. She was very surprised and delighted by Chris's thoughtful gesture. They enjoyed the breakfast together in bed. Starting their day with happiness after they finished eating, he told her that he would come back later in the afternoon to pick her up. They had plans to go together to select outfits for their upcoming wedding. Chris wanted Jane to feel refreshed and ready for their outing, so he encouraged her to take some time to relax before their shopping trip. Jane agreed, feeling grateful for Chris's considerate nature, and settled back into bed for a little while longer. While Chris on his way to work, he decided to call Mary and have a serious conversation with her. He wanted her to stay away from Jane, and him as he sensed some tension building up between them. Mary responded by saying that the only way she would consider staying away from Jane was if Chris paid her off. Shocked by Mary's demand, Chris asked how much money she needed, to his disbelief. Mary replied that she also wanted to have a one-night stand with him in addition to the money. Chris was appalled and firmly rejected her proposal, telling her she was out of her mind. In a desperate attempt to manipulate Chris, Mary threatened that if he didn't agree to her terms, he wouldn't be able to marry Jane. She even went as fast as claiming that Chris should be grateful to her if she hadn't forced Jane outside that night. He wouldn't have had the chance to see her feeling frustrated and angry. Chris couldn't help but express his disappointment in Mary's behavior. He reminded her that instead of being happy for her sister, she is turning herself into a villain by trying to control their lives in such a manipulative way. Chris let out his sigh and hissed, and he ended the call. Mary called Chris back. This time, she changed her mind and didn't just want a one night with him anymore. Instead, she wanted Chris to make her pregnant and give her money so she could leave. Mary said no one would marry her because everyone knew about her past on the streets. She blamed Jane for wanting to leave her behind. Now that she found someone rich, Mary threatened to make Chris and Jane's lives unhappy. If he didn't agree, Chris was very angry. He told Mary to leave him alone, and he said he wouldn't give her anything. He wanted her to stay away from Jane. Then he ended the call later that afternoon. Chris arrived to pick up Jane. They went shopping for things they needed for the wedding. On the day of the wedding, Chris made sure there were security measures in place to prevent anything from going wrong, despite Mary's attempts to sabotage the wedding. Chris's security measures led all her plans. The wedding proceeded smoothly. Chris and Jane were successfully married. They returned to the city as a happily married couple. Mary was deeply hurt by Chris. Marrying Jane, fueled by anger, she began to destroy everything in her house. She felt betrayed, thinking, I sacrificed so much for Jane, and now I have neither a man or money. It would be better if Chris dies so we could be even. She vowed not to let them be happy, believing that if she had no husband, Jane shouldn't have one either. With a bitter laugh, she expressed her resentment. Meanwhile, the newlywed couple enjoyed their moments of happiness together. Phones were off, and he wasn't at home or work either. He wasn't at home or at work. He wasn't at home or at work either. Chris's uncles tried to calm her down and told her to wait until evening news. But as the evening came with no word from Chris, Jane's anxiety became unbearable. She and Chris's uncle decided to go to the police station to report his disappearance. Meanwhile, Mary celebrated her victory, knowing that she had caused pain and suffering for Jane. Jane couldn't sleep all night because she was worried about her missing husband. She called Mary to tell her what happened, hoping for some comfort. But Mary pretended to be sympathetic, pathetic. Even though she was secretly happy that Chris was gone the next morning, the police told Jane they found Chris's car on the road, but he wasn't there. This made Jane even more scared. She cried and blamed herself for not convincing Chris to stay home. Meanwhile, Chris woke up in the hospital after 4 days of being unconscious. When Chris woke up, he immediately thought about Jane. He was worried if she was okay. He wanted to get up, but the nurse said he needed to rest, so he asked the nurse if he could use her phone to call his uncle. Chris called his uncle and told him everything about what happened to him. He asked his uncle to make sure Jane was safe. His uncle actually said Jane was currently with him at his house. Chris begged his uncle to keep Jane safe and not let her leave because he thought she might be in danger. He also told his uncle not to tell anyone where he was until he got better and could go home after the call. Chris.